The train doors hissed shut at Fulton Street, and nobody on car 4 noticed the man in the gray hoodie sitting by the window, because nobody ever did. That was the whole point of him. He had spent the last 6 years learning how to be invisible in a room, how to make his shoulders slope just enough, how to keep his eyes down on his phone even when his ears were doing all the work they were trained to do. His name was Elias Marsh. And if you had asked anyone in that subway car what he did for a living, they would have guessed accountant, maybe warehouse worker, maybe nothing at all. Nobody would have guessed Force Recon. Nobody would have guessed the 11 years, the 3 deployments, the citation he kept folded in a drawer he never opened. He liked it that way. He had built a quiet life out of the wreckage of a loud one, and quiet was the only thing he asked the world for anymore. The train rattled north through the tunnel, fluorescent lights strobing over tired faces. There was a mother with a stroller near the doors, rocking it gently though the baby was already asleep. There was an old man with a folded newspaper he wasn't reading, just holding, the way people hold things to feel less alone. There was a teenage boy with headphones so loud Elias could hear the tinny leak of the bass line from 4 seats away. There was a woman in scrubs, eyes closed, catching 5 minutes of rest between 2 12-hour shifts at a hospital that never had enough hands. Ordinary people. The unremarkable, precious ordinariness of a city minding its business at 8:40 in the evening. Elias watched them the way he watched everything now, not because he was looking for trouble, but because 11 years of training does not simply turn off when you take off the uniform. He noticed the exits. He noticed the mother's stroller wheel was slightly loose, clicking every time the train swayed. He noticed the old man had a slight tremor in his left hand. Early Parkinson's maybe, nothing dangerous. He noticed the way the doors at each end of the car had that particular pneumatic sigh that told you no one had propped them recently. These were not thoughts he chose to have. They were thoughts that simply arrived, unbidden, the way breathing arrives, the residue of a life that had once depended on this kind of noticing. He also noticed, 4 stops before anyone else seemed to, that something in the car had changed. It started at the far door, the one connecting to car 3. A man stepped through it wearing a jacket too heavy for the mild evening, hands stuffed deep in the pockets in a way that kept the fabric from swinging naturally, kept it stiff, kept it wrong. Elias clocked him in under 2 seconds, the gait too careful, the eyes scanning the car in sweeps instead of the aimless drift of a tired commuter, the way he positioned himself near the door rather than finding a seat. Behind him came a second man, then a third, spreading out with the unhurried confidence of people who had done this before and expected no resistance. A fourth drifted in from the other end, boxing the car. A fifth stayed near the connecting door they'd just come through, blocking retreat. 5 men, 1 car, rush hour thinning into evening quiet, which meant fewer witnesses, which meant this had been planned, which meant these were not opportunists riding a lucky moment. This was a crew that had done the math on when a train car goes soft. Elias didn't move. He kept his eyes on his phone, thumb scrolling nothing, while his peripheral vision did the real work. He watched the man nearest him, call him the leader, the one whose eyes swept the car last and lingered longest, cataloging rather than searching, reach into his jacket and let just enough of the grip show, not a full draw, a message, a firearm, the kind carried by people who wanted the threat visible, without yet wanting the escalation of pulling it fully. The other 4 followed his lead within a second or two, hands emerging with the practiced non-drama of men who had rehearsed this exact motion in exact mirrors. "Nobody needs to be a hero," the leader said, and his voice was almost gentle, almost bored. The voice of a man reciting a line he'd said so many times it had lost its edge. Phones, wallets, bags, quick and easy, and everybody rides home tonight. The car went rigid with the particular silence of shared fear. The mother pulled her stroller tighter against her body, curling over it like a shell. The old man's newspaper trembled harder now, the tremor no longer subtle. The nurse's eyes had snapped open, and she was doing the math every parent and every caretaker does in these moments. The math of how to protect the people who can't protect themselves. The teenager had yanked his headphones off, face gone the color of paper. Elias sat very still. He let his phone dim in his hand. He was doing his own math, and his math looked different from everyone else's in that car, because his math had a decade of training behind it and a decade of consequences, too. The first thing his mind did automatically was terrain. A subway car is a kill box if you let it be. Narrow, fixed exits, no cover. Ricochet risk-off steel walls that could turn a miss into a second and third victim. Any engagement here had to be surgical, had to close distance fast, had to take the threat off the X before triggers, got pulled in a box full of people who had nowhere to run. The second thing his mind did was threat prioritization. 5 armed men is not 5 equal threats. There is always a hierarchy. The leader who makes decisions. The muscle who reacts to the leader, the nervous ones on the flanks, who are most likely to panic and fire without meaning to. You don't take the biggest one first. You take the one whose fall causes the most confusion in the others, and you take him fast enough that the confusion becomes your only weapon. The third thing his mind did, the thing that had nothing to do with training, and everything to do with the man, he still was underneath it, was look at the mother curled around her stroller and understand, with total clarity, that he could not simply keep his head down tonight. He had promised himself when he got out that he was done. Done being the guy who ran toward gunfire. Done being the reason his ex-wife stopped sleeping through the night. Done being the reason his daughter, 7 years old now, video called a father who sometimes flinched at fireworks. He had built this quiet life brick by brick, and every brick was a promise, no more. He was an accountant now, for real, at a small firm 2 blocks from this station, and he liked spreadsheets because spreadsheets never asked. Anything of him he wasn't willing to give. He liked the ordinary Tuesday. He liked the ordinary train ride home, but the file room in his head that held 11. Years of training didn't care about promises, made in therapy offices. It cared about the mother's white knuckles on the stroller handle. It cared about the old man's shaking newspaper. It cared more than anything about the particular, terrible arithmetic of what happens to a subway car full of unarmed civilians. When 5 men with guns get spooked, or greedy, or bored, and someone's finger tightens on a trigger by accident. He set his phone face down on his knee, slow, nothing sudden. His eyes finally lifted, and for the first time since the men had entered the car, he really looked at them. Not with fear, but with the flat, cataloging attention of a man doing inventory. Leader nearest the front door, gun half drawn, comfortable, talking. Second man to his left, younger, gun fully out, held sideways in the way that television teaches and training never does, which told Elias this one had probably never actually fired it at a person. Third man near the far door, older, gun low and steady, the only one who looked like he had. Real trigger time. This one was the actual danger in the room. Fourth man drifting near the middle doing the collecting, holding out a duffel bag toward passengers with an almost apologetic shrug, as though he too found this whole business tedious. Fifth man blocking the connecting door behind them, watching the platform windows flash by outside, as if checking for a stop where reinforcements or an exit might change the equation. The leader's eyes finally landed on Elias. Really landed. The way a predator's eyes land on the one animal in a herd that isn't moving with the panic of the rest. "You deaf, buddy?" the leader said, taking 2 steps closer. "Phone, wallet, now." Elias looked up at him, and something in his face, not defiance exactly, something quieter and much more unsettling, made the leader's easy voice falter for just a half-second. "Sure," Elias said. His voice was calm in a way that didn't match the room. "Just don't want anybody getting hurt over a phone that's worth about as much as your bail's going to be." It was a strange thing to say, almost absurdly casual, and for a moment the leader's face flickered between confusion and offense, trying to decide if he'd just been mocked. That half-second of decision-making is, in close-quarters engagement, an eternity. Elias had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous window in any violent encounter is the one where an armed man is surprised into thinking instead of reacting, because thinking is slow and reacting is fast. And if you can steal that window from someone, you can end an entire fight before it starts. He used it. His hand moved before the leader's brain had finished processing the sentence he'd just heard. It wasn't fast in the movie sense. Not a blur, not superhuman. It was fast in the way that only comes from 10,000 repetitions. The body doing what the body had been drilled to do so many times that thought became unnecessary friction. His hand closed over the leader's wrist and the barrel of the half-drawn weapon in the same motion, twisting the joint at an angle. The human wrist was never built to survive. Without releasing whatever it's holding, and the gun clattered against the subway floor as the leader's knees buckled from the shock. Traveling up his arm, Elias didn't let go of the wrist. He used it as a lever, driving the man down and sideways, using his own falling weight to put him on the ground, in a controlled collapse that looked, to the terrified passengers watching, like something between violence and dance. The second man, the young one, the one who'd never fired his weapon at a living target, reacted the way untrained men with guns always react to sudden chaos, badly and late. He swung the pistol toward Elias, but his brain was still, catching up to the fact that his leader was already on the ground, and that half-second of catching up was, again, everything. Elias was already moving, closing the 3 feet of distance between them low and fast, one hand sweeping the barrel of the gun offline, away from the packed car, away from the mother and the stroller, away from anyone who could be hit if the trigger got pulled by reflex, while his other hand drove upward into the man's jaw with the kind of economical force that ends a person's participation in a fight without ending their life. The gun skittered under a seat. The young man folded. 2 down in under 4 seconds. The car had barely finished registering that anything was happening at all. The third man, the older one with the steady low grip, the one Elias had marked as the real danger, he reacted correctly, which made him the only genuine threat left in the equation. He didn't panic. He didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon with the flat. Practiced calm of someone who had done this before, and he had a clear line because Elias, mid-motion from taking down the second man, had his back partially turned. What happened next was the kind of thing that, if you asked the passengers afterward, none of them could quite agree on, because trauma does strange things to memory, but they all agreed on this much. The accountant-looking man in the gray hoodie somehow knew, without turning to look, exactly where that third gun was pointed. It was not magic. It was training so deep it had become instinct. The peripheral tracking of movement, the almost supernatural sensitivity to shifts in weight and air that comes from years of close-quarters work in rooms, far more dangerous than a subway car. Elias dropped his center of gravity and pivoted at the same instant the older man's finger began its final half-inch of pressure on the trigger, and the round that should have taken him, center mass instead tore, through empty air and buried itself, with a flat metallic crack that made every civilian in the car scream, into the steel paneling above the connecting door. No ricochet, no second casualty. The angle of impact and the material of the panel absorbed it clean, which was not luck so much as the geometry. Elias had already calculated 3 seconds earlier, back when this was still just a mental map and not yet a fight. He closed the distance in the same motion as the dodge, which is the part that separates trained violence from untrained violence. The counter isn't a second action. It's the same action continued. His shoulder drove into the older man's chest, off-balancing him against the pole by the door, and his hand found the man's gun wrist in the same brutal, practiced grip he'd used on the leader, twisting until tendons screamed and fingers opened, whether their owner wanted them to or not. The second weapon hit the floor. Elias used the man's own falling momentum to put him, face first against the subway pole, hard enough to end the fight, not hard enough to end a life, because that line, that exact, careful, professional line, was one he had spent 11 years learning to walk and had never once, in combat or after it, crossed by accident. 3 down, 2 left. The fourth man, the one collecting phones and wallets with his almost apologetic duffel bag, had frozen the moment the shot went off, the human instinct to flinch at gunfire overriding whatever training or nerve he might have had. He was already dropping the bag, already raising his hands, already understanding, on some primal level, that whatever this night had been supposed to be, it had stopped being that about 8 seconds ago. Elias didn't even need to engage him with force. A single step forward, a look that promised exactly what would happen if those hands came down toward a pocket, and the man sank to his knees on his own, hands laced behind his head like he'd seen it done on television and figured it was the posture that ended badly for him least often. That left the fifth man, the one who had been watching the platforms roll by outside, the one positioned at the connecting door as a lookout and an escape route. And this was the man who, in the space of those 8 seconds, had gone from board sentry to the last variable in an equation. That had stopped making sense to him. He had a gun, he had a door at his back, and he had. Elias saw immediately the wide, unblinking eyes of a man whose plan had never once accounted for what to do. If things went wrong this fast, this completely. Panic is its own kind of danger, sometimes worse than competence, because a panicking man with a gun is unpredictable in ways a trained one is not. Elias's voice, when it came, was the same flat calm it had been from the very start of the encounter. The voice he used to imagine using with his daughter someday, when she was old enough to be scared of something and need her. Father to sound like the scared part of the world was already handled. "Look at your friends on the floor," Elias said, not moving toward him, giving him the room panic needed to not do something fatal to himself or anyone else. "Look at how fast that happened. You've got about 2 seconds to decide if tonight is the night. You get a story to tell your kids someday, or the night you don't get to have kids to tell it to. Put it down." It was not a threat exactly. It was worse than a threat. Because a threat implies uncertainty, implies negotiation, and there was none of that in the sentence at all. Just the flat statement of a fact that had already been proven. 4 times on the floor of that subway car in the last handful of seconds. The fifth man's hand shook. The gun wavered. And then, in the particular anticlimax that real violence almost always ends in, unlike the movies, he simply let it drop, the metal clattering against the floor with a sound that seemed, in the ringing silence of the aftermath, unbearably loud. The train was pulling into the next station. For a moment, nobody in that car moved. The mother stared at Elias with an expression that was somewhere between terror and reverence, one hand still wrapped protectively around the stroller, the other pressed flat against her own chest as though checking that her heart was still beating at a survivable rate. The old man had stopped shaking. His newspaper had fallen unnoticed to the floor, forgotten in a way that a folded newspaper had probably never been forgotten by a lonely man in years. The nurse was already moving toward the second man. The young one Elias had put down with a single strike, checking with professional, steady hands whether his jaw was broken, because some instincts don't turn off, even in the middle of terror. Some people are built to help. The same way Elias was built for this. The teenager had his phone up, hands trembling too hard to hold it steady, filming what he clearly understood, even through the fog of adrenaline, was something he would be asked about for the rest of his life. Elias stood in the middle of it all, breathing slightly harder than a man his age should have been after 8 seconds of work, not because the exertion had been great, but because his body was flooding with the particular chemical wash that comes after violence ends, and the danger passes and the mind finally has room to feel what it just did. His hands, when he looked down at them, were steady. That, more than anything, told him something about who he still was underneath the quiet accountant's life he'd built. The hands were always the truth-teller. Shaking hands meant you'd done something you weren't built for. Steady hands meant the body had simply done what it was designed to do, the way a hand doesn't shake after catching a ball. It's caught 1,000 times before. The train doors opened. Transit police, alerted by an automatic alarm. The leader's dropped gun had apparently triggered against the floor sensor. An irony nobody in that car would ever be able to fully appreciate, until they'd had time to process the night. Flooded onto the platform, weapons drawn, shouting instructions that dissolved, once they saw the scene, into confusion, and then something like professional respect. Elias didn't run. Running is what guilty men do, and more than that, running would have meant leaving before he was sure, genuinely, completely sure, that the mother and her stroller, the old man and his tremor, the nurse who'd worked a double shift only to end it, disarming panic in a stranger's jaw, the teenager with his shaking phone, all of them, every single one of them, was going to walk off that train tonight exactly as whole as they had walked onto it. He stood with his hands visible, said, "I'm not armed. There are 5 men down. Please check on the passengers first," in the same flat, calm voice he'd used on the 5th man, and waited. It took the transit officers a full minute of statements from terrified, grateful passengers before they understood that the man standing calmly in the middle of the car, the one they'd initially trained their weapons on out of pure procedural caution, was not a 6th attacker, but the reason there hadn't been a tragedy at all. The story, of course, did not stay small. It never does. Somebody's shaky phone footage, the teenager's as it turned out, The boy who would later say in an interview that his hands hadn't stopped shaking for 2 hours afterward, but he'd known, somehow, that he needed to keep filming, made its way onto every platform by morning. The headlines varied in their restraint. Some called him a hero. Some called him a mystery man. One particularly breathless outlet ran the phrase, "Subway Superman," over a still frame of Elias, standing amid 4 fallen attackers with the flat, unbothered expression of a man who had just finished a mildly inconvenient errand. None of the headlines at first had his name. That changed within 36 hours, because in a city of 8 million cameras, a face like his does not stay anonymous for long, and because a reporter with more patience than most started asking the right kind of questions to the right kind of retired servicemen, the ones who talk to each other in ways that ripple outward, slowly until eventually they reach a journalist's inbox. Elias Marsh, Force Recon, 11 years, 3 deployments, a Silver Star. He had never once mentioned to a single coworker at the accounting firm where he had spent the last 2 years quietly reconciling other people's numbers. His firm found out the same way everyone else did, from the news. His boss, a mild, unassuming man named Harold who had spent 2 years assuming. Elias was simply the quiet type. Called him into his office not to reprimand him, but to ask, with something like wonder in his voice, why on earth a man with that kind of record was doing tax reconciliations for a firm that mostly handled small restaurants and dry cleaners. Elias's answer was the same answer he gave everyone who asked. In the days that followed, from reporters to strangers on the street who recognized him to, eventually, his own daughter on a video call where she stared at her father's face on the news with an expression somewhere between confusion and a dawning, complicated pride. I didn't want to be a hero, he told all of them, in one form or another. I just didn't want to be the reason it happened to someone else because I was too scared to be the reason it didn't. It was not a perfect answer, but it was an honest one. And honesty, it turned out, was the thing that made the story travel as far as it did, not the violence. People forget violence quickly. The details blur. The specifics of who hit whom and how fast fade within a news cycle or two. What people remembered, what people kept talking about in comment sections and dinner tables and the quiet moments between strangers, on their own subway rides home, was the 8 seconds. The idea that safety, real safety, the kind you don't think about until it's threatened, is sometimes held up by exactly one person in a room who has decided, against every reasonable instinct towards self-preservation, that the story doesn't get to end badly tonight. The nurse who had checked on the second man's jaw ended up writing a letter to the local paper, describing what she'd felt in that car. Not fear exactly, or not only fear, but something she called, in words far more eloquent than she probably felt capable of in the moment, the strange, terrible privilege of watching someone else's entire life of preparation exist for exactly 8 seconds, purely so that mine could keep going, exactly as boring and unremarkable as it was before. The old man with the tremor was interviewed on a local morning show, and when asked what he remembered most, he said it wasn't the gun or the fear, or even the fight. It was the sound of the fifth attacker's weapon hitting the floor, the specific clatter of it, because that sound, he said, was the sound of the rest of his ordinary Tuesday being handed back to him. The mother with the stroller never gave an interview. She was asked, repeatedly, by outlets that offered increasingly large sums for her story, and every time she declined, saying only, through a spokesperson eventually hired by the transit authority to field the flood of requests, that she didn't want her child's first brush with danger to become anyone's content. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the more dignified responses to come out of the entire ordeal, a reminder that not every survivor wants to be a character in someone else's narrative, that some people, having been given their ordinary lives back, simply want to go live them. Elias, for his part, tried for exactly 9 days to keep working at the accounting firm as though nothing had changed. It did not work. Reporters camped outside the building until Harold, his boss, gently suggested, with the kind of awkward, well-meaning honesty of a man who genuinely liked his employee, but recognized an unsustainable situation, when he saw one, that perhaps a leave of absence might serve everyone better. Elias took it. He spent those first weeks doing the things that men in his position are supposed to do, turning down television interviews, accepting exactly one, from a local station whose reporter had covered veteran reintegration stories for a decade and treated the whole thing with a gravity that felt earned rather than performed, declining every offer to write a book, at least for now. Though a literary agent's voicemail sat unanswered on his phone for weeks, a door he wasn't sure yet whether he wanted to walk through. What he did do, in those strange in-between weeks, was visit the mother, not for an interview, not for a photo, but because he had noticed. In that 8-second window that had felt so much longer to everyone in that car, the exact expression on her face when she curled around the stroller. An expression he recognized because he had seen it before, on faces in villages an ocean away, on faces of people who had learned the hard way that the world does not always protect the ones who cannot protect themselves. He found her through the transit authority, not to intrude but simply to ask, quietly, off the record, whether she and her child were doing all right, whether there was anything, nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines, that a stranger who happened to be there that night could do to help settle the ordinary business of an ordinary life shaken by one extraordinary evening. She cried, she told him later. Not from fear this time, but from the strange, specific relief of being seen not as a headline or a victim, but simply as a mother whose child was safe, checked on by the one person in the world who fully understood exactly how close that safety had come to being taken from her. The 5 men, in the weeks that followed, made their way through the machinery of the justice system with the particular anticlimax that violent men often meet once the adrenaline of their crime has drained away and been replaced by fluorescent-lit courtrooms and public defenders who had seen 100 cases just like theirs. The leader, it turned out, had a record stretching back over a decade, a career criminal who had built an entire operating theory around soft targets and empty train cars, a theory that had worked, by his own later admission during questioning, 11 times before this one. He had never, in those 11 times, encountered someone in the car who did anything but comply. His mistake, as the arresting officers noted with something between professional satisfaction and genuine disbelief, had been assuming that number 12 would go the same way as the previous 11. The prosecutor working the case, a sharp-eyed woman named Dana Whitfield, who had spent years watching men like this cycle in and out of the system, used a phrase in her closing argument that ended up quoted almost as widely as the teenager's shaky video footage. She said that the 5 men on that train had made exactly one miscalculation, the same miscalculation predators of every kind make when they mistake quiet for weakness. They had looked at a car full of ordinary people and assumed that ordinary meant unprotected, when in fact, on that particular Tuesday evening, on that particular train, ordinary had been sitting 3 seats down the whole time, scrolling a phone, saying nothing, waiting. It would be easy, in the retelling, to make this into a simple story. Armed men, brave hero, justice served, credits roll. But the truth of what happened in the weeks and months after that night was messier and more human than any headline could capture. Because heroism, real heroism, is rarely a clean thing. Elias struggled in the aftermath with something he hadn't expected. Not guilt over what he'd done, because he knew, with the moral clarity of a man who had made peace with violence long before that Tuesday, that every choice he'd made in those 8 seconds had been the right one, the careful one, the one that ended a threat without ending a life. What he struggled with instead was the strange grief of having his quiet life taken from him not by tragedy this time, but by recognition, the particular loneliness of a man who had spent 2 years building anonymity brick by brick, only to watch it dissolve in the span of one video clip, replaced by a version of himself the whole world now claimed to know. He talked about this eventually in the one interview he gave, and it was this part of the conversation, more than the fight itself, that seemed to resonate hardest with people who watched it. He said that the hardest part of what happened wasn't the 8 seconds on the train. It was the 8 weeks afterward, learning how to be a person again in a world that now wanted him to be a symbol. He said that every veteran he'd ever served understood this feeling in their bones, the vertigo of being asked to be extraordinary in public, when what you'd spent years learning, painfully, expensively, was how to survive by being ordinary in private. His daughter, 7 years old, asked him during one of their video calls whether he was scared that night on the train, and Elias told her the truth, because he'd promised himself a long time ago that he would never lie to her about the things that mattered. He said yes. He said he was scared the whole time. Scared in a way that never fully goes away no matter how much training sits underneath it. But that being scared and doing the right thing anyway were not opposites. They were, in fact, the exact same muscle, just used at the same time. She thought about this for a long moment. In the particular serious way 7-year-olds think about things that matter to them. And then she said something that Elias would repeat months later, to a room full of veterans at a support group. He'd started attending not because he needed it, though maybe he did, but because he understood, now more than ever, that no one gets through the after of violence alone, no matter how quiet their life looks from the outside. She said, "So you were the safe part even though you were scared." He didn't have a better way to explain it than that. Not in all the interviews he eventually agreed to, not in the eulogy he gave months later at the funeral of an old squad mate who hadn't made it through his own after, not in any conversation he ever had about that Tuesday evening on the train. He had been the safe part even though he was scared. That was the whole of it. That was, he came to believe, the whole of what courage actually was, not the absence of fear, not some mythical fearlessness that action movies had sold an entire generation, but simply the decision, made in the space of a half-second window that thinking always tries to close, to be the safe part for someone else, even when your own hands are shaking underneath the calm. The mother's child, now old enough to understand a little of what had happened on a train before she was born. I'd know. That isn't quite right. She had been there, asleep in the stroller through the entire encounter, waking only afterward to a car full of strangers, crying with relief. That child would grow up, eventually hearing a version of this story told at family gatherings, softened over the years into something closer to legend than memory. The way all the truly important things that happen to us eventually get softened, because the human mind is not built to hold the sharp edges of fear forever. But somewhere underneath the softened, legend version of the story, there would always be the plain fact of it. That on one ordinary Tuesday evening, 5 armed men made the mistake of assuming that quiet meant defenseless. And they were wrong, and because they were wrong, an entire subway car full of ordinary people got to go home and keep living their ordinary, precious, unremarkable lives, uninterrupted, the way ordinary lives are supposed to go. Elias eventually went back to accounting, though not at the same firm. Harold understood, without needing to be told, that the cameras would never fully leave that building alone, and he helped Elias find a smaller practice, 2 towns over where nobody recognized his face at all, which was, in the end, exactly the gift Elias needed most. He still rides trains sometimes, though friends who know his story have asked him, half joking and half not, whether he ever gets nervous doing it now. He tells them no, and he means it, because the truth he learned that Tuesday evening wasn't that the world is full of danger, waiting behind every subway door. The truth he learned was smaller and stranger and somehow more comforting than that. That most of the time, most people, on most trains, are exactly what they appear to be. Tired parents and shift workers and lonely old men with newspapers. They don't read, and teenagers with music too loud for their own ears. That the vast majority of every ordinary day really is ordinary, all the way through. But once in a great while, on one particular Tuesday among 10,000 unremarkable ones, 5 men will walk into a subway car and make the mistake of thinking that ordinary is the same thing as unprotected. And if you are very lucky, if the universe, for reasons it never explains and never apologizes for, has arranged for exactly the right quiet, unassuming stranger to be sitting 3 seats down, scrolling his phone, saying nothing, then that mistake will be the last one those men ever get to make freely, and the ordinary Tuesday will simply keep being ordinary, all the way to the last stop, all the way home. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere around those 8 seconds, that's the whole reason stories like this deserve to be told, not to glorify violence, but to remind us of something quieter and more important underneath it. That courage rarely announces itself in advance. That the person minding their own business next to you on a train might be carrying more strength than you'll ever know, and that ordinary decency, the kind that shows up scared and does the right thing anyway, is still very much alive in this world. If you want more stories like this one, true-to-life tales of quiet heroes, hidden strength, and the moments that reveal exactly who someone really is, hit subscribe, leave a comment telling us what part of this story stayed with you the longest, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the quiet ones are so often the strongest ones in the room. We'll see you in the next story.